In the beginning, Eru, the One, who in the Elvish tongue is named Iluvatar, made the Ainur of his thought, and they made a great music before him. In this music the world was begun, for Iluvatar made visible the song of the Ainur, and they beheld it as a light in the darkness. And many among them became enamored of its beauty and of its history, which they saw beginning and unfolding as in a vision. Therefore Iluvatar gave to their vision being, and set it amid the void, and the secret fire was sent to burn at the heart of the world, and it was called Ea. Then those of the Ainur who desired it arose and entered into the world at the beginning of time, and it was their task to achieve it, and by their labors to fulfill the vision which they had seen. Long they labored in the regions of Ea, which are vast beyond the thought of elves and men, until in the time appointed was made Arda, the kingdom of earth. Then they put on the raiment of earth and descended into it, and dwelt therein. The great among these spirits the elves named the Valar, the powers of Arda, and men have often called them gods. The lords of the Valar are 7, and the Valier, the queens of the Valar, are 7 also. These were their names in the Elvish tongue as it was spoken in Valinor, though they have other names in the speech of the elves in Middle-earth, and their names among men are manifold. The names of the Lord in due order are Manwe, Ulmo, Aule, Orome, Mandos, Lorien, and Tolkas. And the names of the queens are Varda, Yavanna, Niena, Este, Vara, Vana, and Nessa. Melkor is counted no longer among the Valar, and his name is not spoken upon earth. Welcome. I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is The Forge of Tolkien. What happens when angels enter into material creation? It's a bit of a paradox, and it's of a piece with the paradoxes that we've been wrestling with, if you consider it all along, with understanding what Tolkien's up to with his subcreation and storytelling. And it reminds you back to the summer, back to the beginning of our conversations about his work, all of the tensions that I talked about with you in the first set of these videos, right? When we were talking about his method and the crafting of the stories and the kinds of problems that he was wrestling with in wanting to write the kinds of stories that he did. We've dealt with the tension above all between, say, for example, time travel and dreams, but above all, this tension between history and myth, over and over and over again, the sense of the distinction between stories that seem to exist before time, out of time, in a time that is not history, and the existence of stories that work within time, right? And you realize in this moment that I've just read to you, and this is actually from the Valaquinta, not the Ainur Lindale, which is what we've been talking about, which is the music of the Ainur, with the music of creation. Well, now there's another text that comes next in the Silmarillion, as Christopher published it, that tells us of the Valar, the account of the Valar and the Maiar according to the lore of the Eldar. And in this opening paragraph, we have a synopsis of what happens to the Ainur in the course of the stories, that they are there with Iluvatar at the beginning singing, and he makes visible their song, and they behold it as a light in the darkness. And then becoming enamored of it, becoming enamored of the beauty of this pattern, this design, this music that he's shown them, they want to enter into it, right? Which is a kind of tricky claim. And I got myself tangled up in the last couple episodes, realizing how many layers of philosophy Tolkien is always sort of throwing at us all at once. And in this episode, I want to back up a little bit and think about what he seems to be doing by way of looking more closely at these main characters, the Ainur who become the Valar, and realize that the kinds of things that he's doing with his creation story deeply have to do with this relationship between myth and history, between the pattern, the story, the meaning, and its unfolding in time, its unfolding in history, right? So many among the Ainur become enamored of the beauty of the music that they've been shown. Iluvatar has shown them this music that they've been making, and of its history, which they saw beginning and unfolding as in a vision. Now, I say there's lots and lots of complicated layers, because Tolkien retold the Ainulindale a few times, where he's trying to wrestle with exactly at what point the Ainur enter into it, right? Whether he's shown them the vision, they enter into it at one point, and then it's created, and we're going to go back to that. We're going to go back to that process, but I want to focus down right now on these characters and who they are, right? Therefore, Iluvatar gave to their vision being and set it amid the void, and the secret fire was sent to burn at the heart of the world, and it was called Ea. Then those of the Ainur who desired it arose and entered into the world at the beginning of time, and it was their task to achieve it, and by their labors to fulfill the vision which they had seen. All right, so we have the music of creation, which we've been talking about, and simmering in the background, that problem of who Melkor is, and he's one of these Ainur. He's going to become, as we just heard in the reading, one of the Valar, right? He enters into the created vision, the materialized vision, the actualized, historicized I said materialized. He enters into the vision with the other Ainur, and in entering into it, something happens to them, right? They change names, and therefore Tolkien is trying to show you something. They've gone from being the holy ones to being the powers, right? So when they're singing like the choirs of the angels in the outside, makes it sound like there's a place to be outside, and that's not quite right when you're thinking of heaven and earth, right? Heaven isn't really outside the earth. It's just you have to enter in through the magic portal to get into the earth, right? So there the Ainur are singing in the whatever they are. It's not really the void, because the music goes out into the void as well, and wanting to become part of that beauty, they enter into it. And at the moment of entering into it, one, they become subject to time, which is an interesting problem for them, and they become powers, which means they've been angels insofar as they've been singing, right? And the angelic character persists, but once they enter into time, into history, into Arda as it is made real, made being, given being, right? Actually, it's real before it's given being. They enter into it. They become powers. They become gods. And in the sort of fuller version of their genealogy, which again it goes through several iterations, but we're dealing with the Valaquinta today, just to make it simple, or the Valaquinta as published in Silmarillion. We have 7. Kings, as it were, lords, 7 lords and 7 queens, and the lords, Manwe, Olmo, Aule, Orome, Mondos, Lorien, and Tulkas, and the queens, Varda, Yavanna, Niena, Esta, Vara, Vanna, and Nessa. Melkor is not counted among the Valar, although he is one of these same kinds of creatures. Well, that's an awful lot of backstory. And it's interesting that it's sort of there premised in the appendices in the Lord of the Rings. As always, I'm always trying to figure out exactly what the best setup. It's like right, when I was reviewing, I realized you have the Valar named in the Lord of the Rings, but you don't really have them explained, right? So they're simply there, except for, of course, we do have one of these creatures in the midst of the story in the Lord of the Rings. In fact, it's his name that's the title, right? That Sauron, the Lord of the Rings, is one of these. Well, not quite Valar, because it explains it in the Valaquinta, and the Valaquinta gives little biographies of each of the seven lords and the seven queens, and we'll look at one of those in particular to think about what they mean. But we have, if you want the details of who these characters are, the Valaquinta is the quickest way to get it. We have also a description of the Maiar, which I've already, in fact, talked about. Things like Gandalf and Saruman, they're of the Maiar, right? They're these angelic characters. And we also have those who are not named, those who are not spoken, Melkor, and, of course, Sauron. And it's funny to think that in Tolkien's imagining of all of these stories, the character Sauron, who becomes the sort of the great big baddie, the sort of giant evil character that the hobbits have to face, isn't actually the strongest of any of these. I mean, he's kind of a minor power, right? And so, I mean, Gandalf could have stood up to him fairly effectively because they're of the same power rank, as it were, if you're giving them, I don't know, Dungeons and Dragons I don't know how to play those games, I'm sorry, but if you're giving them power qualities, Gandalf and Sauron are similar, right? But they're lower than the actual Valar. They're of lower power, and Sauron is actually one of he had been previously associated with Ale, which will go into our problem of making and manufacturing and so forth. But he's drawn to Melkor, and so in trying to understand who these Valar are, you're actually also trying to understand what kind of character Sauron is, and he's mentioned at the end of the Valaquinta. So and this is of Melkor, right? So great was the power of his uprising that in ages forgotten he contended with Manwë and all the Valar, and through long years in Arda held dominion over most of the lands of the earth. But he was not alone. For of the Maiar many were drawn to his splendor in the days of his greatness, and remained in that allegiance down into his darkness. This is Melkor. And others he corrupted afterwards to his service with lies and treacherous gifts. Dreadful among these spirits were the Valar Raukar, the scourges of fire that in Middle-earth were called the Balrogs, demons of terror. So the Balrogs are of the same rank of power, as it were, as Gandalf. And among those of his servants that have names the greatest was that of the spirit whom the Eldar called Sauron, or Gorthar the Cruel. In his beginning he was of the Maiar of Aula, and he remained mighty in the lore of that people. In all the deeds of Melkor the Morgoth upon Arda, in his vast works and in the deceits of his cunning, Sauron had a part, and was only less evil than his master, in that for long he served another and not himself. But in after years he rose like a shadow of Morgoth and a ghost of his malice, and walked behind him on the same ruinous path down into the void. Okay, well, that's lovely, mysterious, and nowhere, obviously, explained in The Lord of the Rings, which, of course, means that people early on wrote to Tolkien and said, well, what was he? Who is he? And in one of these early letters, June 1957, to Major Bowen, we have Sauron, we had one of the fuller descriptions of the Valar in order to explain Sauron himself, right? So Tolkien comments to Major Bowen, I note your remarks about Sauron. He was always debodied when vanquished. The theory, if one can dignify the modes of the story with such a term, is that he was a spirit, a minor one, but still an angelic spirit, right? So we have here that's again that twinning of angel power spirit that Tolkien's rubbing off of. According to the mythology of these things, that means that, though of course a creature, he belonged to the race of intelligent beings that were made before the physical world and were permitted to assist in their measure in the making of it. That's Ainur, right? So he belongs to the race of the Ainur, but he's subsidiary to them in Tolkien's thinking. Those who became most involved in this work of art, as it was in the first instance, became so engrossed with it that when the creator made it real, that is, gave it the secondary reality subordinate to his own, which we call primary reality, got that? And so in that hierarchy on the same plane with themselves, they desired to enter into it from the beginning of its realization. Again, it's like, if you've wondered about why Sauron has the powers and the abilities that he does to do all the evil things that we'll be talking about, what it is that Sauron does the evil, it's because in Tolkien's imagining, he actually exists like Melkor and the other Valar before creation, right? So he's somehow entered into it and become what? Well, let's do a little backup here. It's like, what exactly are these Valar and what is Tolkien playing with it? Well, he made some other sort of interesting stabs, which we've become used to in the way Tolkien sets stuff up and then corrects himself and then gets bored and then overdoes it and then over and over and over again. Why doesn't he just call them gods, right? It's like, why doesn't, that Sauron wanted to be, remember the title of the book, it's his name, The Lord of the Rings is Sauron, so the book is named after Sauron, right? It's like, I always thought of The Lord of the Rings as the title, as the question of who would be the Lord of the Rings. But in fact, of course, in the story, Sauron is the Lord of the Rings. He's the only one that can control them. But what is he? Why does he have that level of power? And if you start wondering about that, you say, well, okay, why isn't he just a god? Why isn't the problem just one of, well, what is it, right? And I know this, I know over the long sort of exercise of reading Tolkien with you all, I keep saying, well, there's a Christian element, there's a Christian element, there's a Christian element. And the easiest thing to say is, well, just Sauron's okay, he's Satan, right? The name alliterates. Except, well, there are ways in which he isn't really. Well, okay, what is he, right? We remember back at the beginning when Tolkien is trying to get The Lord of the Rings published, and he's trying to convince the publisher at Collins, right? I was thinking HarperCollins, but it's Collins. He's trying to convince Milton Waldman to publish not just The Lord of the Rings, but the Silmarillion with The Lord of the Rings, because as far as Tolkien was concerned, The Lord of the Rings, in his mind, made no sense without the great backstory of the Silmarillion. And he sketches out the beginnings, right? The myth that translates. It's like, if you will, well, when most of this is history too, right? I was going to say The Lord of the Rings is history and this is the myth and myth meets history. No, because most of the Silmarillion is also history, and we're trying to get inside it, and we're trying to figure out why that's so complicated mythologically, as it were, for Tolkien. Well, he explained to Waldman that it was meant to begin with this great cosmological myth. Again, back to explaining what these Valar are. Cycles begin with a cosmological myth, the music of the Ainur. See, I'm going to learn how to say these names out loud after saying them on camera so many times and getting them wrong. Ainur. God and the Valar, or powers, Englished as gods, are revealed. Except for in the Silmarillion, they're never really actually called gods because the elves get to talk to the... Wait a minute. Okay. God and the Valar, or powers, Englished as gods, are revealed in the music of the Ainur. That's the Ainur Lindale. These latter are, as we should say, angelic powers, whose function is to exercise delegated authority in their spheres of rule and government, not creation, making, or remaking. It's like Tolkien's constantly trying to separate them out, but make them part of the creation, and in the Ainur delay they sing, right? And that makes them, what are they singing the world into creation, or are they singing the pattern that Iluvatar gave them already? He's going back and forth, right? Because he wants them to be working with Iluvatar's pattern, but not themselves be the creator. They are divine, that is, were originally outside and existed before the making of the world. Their power and wisdom is derived from their knowledge of the cosmological drama, which they perceived first as a drama, that is, as in a fashion we perceive a story composed by someone else, and later as a reality. Okay, that's interesting because it's like they've sung the whole thing, theoretically, right? They've sung the entire pattern, they've sung the entire story, but then when they enter into it, they participate in its making. They find out when they enter into it that it's not made in full as they thought, right? They'd only sung the pattern and they enter into it. So do the Valar actually know what's coming? And again, I mean, you realize it's a fairly sophisticated question that Tolkien's wrestling with in Augustinian terms, right? Can God, who's created everything, direct history? You know, where does the creator sit with respect to time and the things that happen in time, the things that unfold in time, the things that, hint hint, spoiler alert, free will makes possible? And the Valar themselves see all of their singing first as a kind of, he said drama, you could say myth, as he says, as in a fashion we perceive a story composed by someone else. So if you're reading The Lord of the Rings, you're outside of the story. You read the characters going through all of their adventures, but you know yourself outside the story how it all turns out, right? So, but they want, as we learned in the Valaquinta, they fall in love with the beauty of the pattern and the singing, and they enter into it, and it becomes their task to achieve it, right? So it's first they're outside and then they enter into the story as a reality. I have been trying to explain this kind of story pattern, entering into it, living the reality out, all this past month, right? Definitely this past week, as we watched events in history play out as I saw it on our national stage. And I've done a number of blog posts on Fencing Bear to this effect, right? We watch ourselves somehow both knowing the story from the outside, because the Bible is what's happening, framing this one, right, too. But the Bible is the sort of grand narrative that we know that we're living in from Genesis to Revelation, but seeing ourselves at different places inside of it, it's like it tells the whole pattern, but we're also in time, we're also in history, and the degree to which we find ourselves living that story is very, very complicated. And Tolkien is trying to give us some flavor of that from the perspective of the Ainur who become the Valar, right? They perceive it first as a drama and then enter into it as a reality. You realize this is, this frame entering into it is always Tolkien's, it's a obsession, but the theoretical knife edge that he's what's the right metaphor? Well, it really, really matters to him, and I'm trying to get you to being sort of the pow moment where you understand why it's so cool, right? On the side of mere narrative device, this is, of course, meant to provide beings of the same order, beauty, power, and majesty as the gods of higher mythology. Okay, so he clearly, it's like he and C.S. Lewis had lots of conversations about mythology and the realness of mythology. And you remember, again, way back at the very beginning of our discussions, I was talking about the poem that Tolkien wrote for Lewis, and saying the mythopoeia, right? That the myths carry truth. They're not lies breathed through silver. They're not just beautiful, that they carry truth. And so Tolkien, in writing his own cosmogonical myth, wants to replicate the sorts of cosmogonical myths that for example, the Greeks have with their pantheon, or the Germanic peoples had with their, assembly of gods. And that's what he admits he's wanting to do with these Valar, right? That they are angelic powers, but once they enter into the world, they become, well, properly speaking in Christian terms, they've just become demons, right? Not just all Melkors. We were talking about the giant, the sons of God entering into the daughters of men, and in last episode, and talking about the giants and so forth. I've become obsessed with giants now, not just because of Owen and his truthful giantness, but in all of the fairy tales, right, that they're in the junior classics. There's lots of giant stories. Giants appear constantly in European mythology, right? The Valar have entered into the story. The Ainur have entered into the story, become gods, and therefore that should be simple, right? We're telling the story about the gods. Except there's a caveat, which is always what Tolkien is doing when he's setting you up for these. On the side of your narrative device, this is of course meant to provide beings of the same order of beauty, power, and majesty as the gods of higher mythology, which can yet be accepted, well, shall we say baldly, by a mind that believes in the blessed Trinity. Okie dokie, right? And here's where, it's like we have now gods. We have Aule, who is, Aule. Aule's of course everybody's favorite because he makes the dwarves. But we have Manwë, who's, well, I want to tell you about Manwë in more detail. We have Varda, Lady of the Stars. We have Ulmo, Lord of the Waters. We have Aule, who makes things. He's a smith and master of all crafts. We have a Yavanna, the giver of fruits. The Feinturi, masters of spirits, called most often Mandos and Lorien for the places that they rule over. Nienna, who's acquainted with grief and mourns for every wound that Arda has suffered in the marring of Melkor. Tulkas, who's the hunter. And Orome, who is... Tulkas is a hunter as well. And as is Orome, right? Orome is a hunter and monsters of fell beasts. Tulkas is the Valiant, Astaldo the Valiant, right? I've left out a few. Anyway, you get the idea that the Valar, they carry with them as they come into Arda, and as they come into creation, the same kind of characteristics that they had as angelic powers, the spirits of the winds and the waters and the frost and the seasons and such, singing before the throne of Iluvatar and making great music. When they enter into Arda, they carry with them those affinities, and so become, like, therefore, gods of antiquity, or gods of the pagans, right? They become gods of war and gods of agriculture and gods of smithing. Aule is like Vulcan, for example. And yet, conceived in an understanding which can be accepted, shall we say baldly, by a mind that believes in the blessed Trinity. Well, how is Tolkien going to pull this one off? Right? It's like, why don't we just have, think about all of the different fantasy stories that have been written since Tolkien, and they always have, at least in my thinking of it. I go to Terry Pratchett because he's the ones that I've read the most, and he kind of skits this all, right? They have the pantheon. He has the pantheon of gods, and the gods have their different repertoires of cults and followers. And in Ankh-Morpork, the great city, they all have their own priests, and the priests all have to come together, as a council under the state who makes sure that they all sort of behave. But other fantasy authors don't really seem to worry about this, right? They just populate their worlds. And again, I wish I had, in the description you could, or give comments you could tell me, but think about the times that fantasy authors actually worry on this level about making sure that their god characters, their divinities, don't rub up against the problem of actually believing in the Trinity. Now, Tolkien made a similar caution, not just in this letter to Milton Waldman, And it's interesting with pitching it to Waldman, he didn't have to, he was just trying to tell him it was a great story and he really needed the whole thing and he needed the entire myth. And why not say, hey, this is cool, I've made up this mythology for England and, put a story in it. No, he wanted it to be theologically robust enough to still be acceptable within his own Catholic. He doesn't. He just has a mind that believes in the Blessed Trinity, right? He doesn't land on it or mark it specifically as Catholic. He wants his powers of creation, despite the fact that they have, names and properties and are powers and seem to, among other things, be spirits like Sauron who can, have a role in the story. He still wants them not to be against an understanding of the Trinity. Well, writing a little bit later to one of his Catholic friends, and this is again one of these great expository letters. It's 153 to Peter Hastings. The one to Milton Waldman, is 131, right? The letter to Peter Hastings is also very important because Hastings was the manager of a Catholic bookshop in Oxford. And so in this letter, Tolkien's getting a little closer to talking about the theological problems that he's setting up with this story and having, gods but not gods. Okay, so he's been telling Hastings the story and things about Elrond and Galadriel and so forth, and the sort of basic plot of the overarching narrative. As for, quote, whose authority decides these things, right? Whose authority decides these things in the, I think actually Hastings had asked him that. Yes. Hastings had asked Tolkien if he had not overstepped the mark in metaphysical matters, worrying about the creation of evil and dealings with creators, between creators and creatures, and so forth. But he'd also clearly asked, sort of like, what divinity do you envision overseeing the events of your story? And Tolkien responds to him, well, as for whose authority decides these things, the immediate authorities are the Valar, the powers or authorities. So now they're not just powers, they're authorities, and that they are taking on the names of the usual names of the ranks of the angels. How I should be able to name them off. Happily, I have a handy list, right? The usual names in at least medieval sort of ranking of the angels: seraphim and cherubim, so at the top, right? Thrones, dominions, virtues, powers or authorities, principalities or rulers, archangels, and angels. So he's in effect equating his Valar as powers or authority with the fourth rank, the usual fourth rank of the it's the pseudo-Dionysian celestial hierarchy, right? So his powers or authorities are the Valar, are the gods, but typical usual Tolkienian caveat, but they are only created spirits of high angelic order, we should say, with their attendant lesser angels, reverend therefore, but not worshipful. And though potently subcreative and resident on earth, to which they are bound by love, having assisted in its making and ordering, they cannot by their own will alter any fundamental provision. And the specific example he gives is the Numenor, but there's which we'll get to, don't worry, probably. Of course we will. There's layers and layers. Okay, there's a footnote here with worshipful, right? And again, I'm wondering whether you've wondered about all of these things. It's like, what kind of being is Sauron? Okay, so we've got him subsidiary to the actual powers. He's like a little god. He's a godlet who can, potentially threaten all of Middle Earth with overtaking it, but never mind. And yet the powers, as Tolkien has just said, don't really have any. in Middle Earth, not to the extent that they could challenge Iluvatar. More cake and eating it too. Okay, fine. But reverend, therefore, but not worshipful. Footnote. There are thus no temples or churches or fanes in this world among good peoples. They had little or no religion in the sense of worship. For help, they may call on a Vala as Elbereth. Elbereth is Varda, the Lady of the Stars, right? So every time one of the characters in Lord of the Rings calls on, oh, Elbereth, they're effectively prayers, right? They're effectively invocations of a goddess, which, interestingly, Tolkien kind of fudges by never translating them, so they're always in Elvish. But it's like, he so wants this to be a sacred story. He so wants it to be not just the true mythology, but true religion, right? But he knows that if he gives his Valar the characteristics of actually being worshipped, then he's fallen into idolatry, potentially, certainly, yes, paganism, certainly. And yet he wants them to be something, right? So the characters can pray to Elbereth effectively. But they call on them not as gods, but he says, for their help they may call on Avala as a Catholic might on a saint, though no doubt knowing in theory as well as he that the power of the Vala was limited and derivative. Again, over and over and over again, these Valar come into the world, they've sung it, they've sung the beauty of it with, before Iluvatar, and Iluvatar has created the whole thing, they've entered into it, and they've become something while they're inside it, but he doesn't want to make them actually gods. He says, but this is a primitive age, and these folk may be said to view the Valar as children view their parents, or immediate adult superiors. Though they know they're subjects of the king, he does not live in their country, nor have there any dwelling. I do not think hobbits practiced any form of worship or prayer, unless through exceptional contact with elves. Right, so they're like divinities, but they're not like divinities, and yet they're part of the world. Why is Tolkien so hesitant just to make them pagan deities, right? He could, it's interesting that he doesn't do it by ways just saying, well, they're angels, because he doesn't, right? They're just not Gabriel and Michael and characters like that. That would actually be veering too close to actual magic, right? Remember when we talked about the names of the angels in the Sworn Book of Thebes, back with magic words, right? That if he simply made them angels with direction over the characters, perhaps, maybe that would just get too close to being actual magic, right? He'd have to name angels, and that would be beyond his willingness to go. But on the other hand, in order to give, a certain character to his mythology, as in fact having divinities, he has the Valar, but he doesn't let them be worshipped, except for Sauron, who, is trying to draw all worship to himself, which is why he's so evil, if you wondered. Yes, he is trying to make himself the god of the world, which is bad, but it's like, even as Tolkien gives him in story world potentially that power, he takes it away because he says the Valar don't have that in the first place, so why should Sauron be so terrifying? Well, what is it that Tolkien is skirting along the edge of here? Well, what is, in fact, I hope you like this. What is, in fact, the huge challenge? The great, big, giant, enormous. Okay, yes, I've been watching that one a bit. Shh. What is the absolutely insurmountable challenge for thinking, for a mind that believes in the Blessed Trinity? And it ain't 3 in 1. I'm sorry, it's not. The 3 in 1 becomes much simpler if you realize that that's not the problem. What is the problem? And it's the thing that Islam denies. It's definitely the thing that Judaism denies, but Islam denies it too. While giving reverence to Jesus as a prophet, right? Prophets speak with the inspiration of God, right? That they are filled with understanding of God. Maybe an angel comes to them like Gabriel and speaks to them and gives them a message from God, and they can speak it. The problem with believing in the Blessed Trinity is the incarnation, right? It's in fact believing somehow that the Creator can enter into his own story. You know, think, okay, just stay with me, right? Think about what I've been, showing you that Tolkien is wrestling with most in describing the relationship of the Valar to the created world, right? That they are there at the beginning, singing before the throne, although he doesn't really talk about the throne because he's trying really hard in the description of Iluvatar, Area the One, just to have it be music, right? There's no embodiment. How would Iluvatar sit on a throne? He's just the one, right? And they sing, and so there's the music, right? But when they become enamored of its beauty, they enter into the world and take on bodies, right? And that is in fact described more fully in the Ainulindale, after they've been singing the music, and as they enter into it, they realize that everything that they've sung was only a foreshadowing. But now that they entered in at the beginning of time, they perceive that the world had been but foreshadowed and forsung, and they must achieve it. How do they go about achieving it? Well, they begin great labors. They begin great crafting, great subcreation, maybe. I don't know. They've been participating in the singing, right? And they enter into it, and themselves enter into it, right? It's like they don't just swirl around like powers. Although, interestingly, Sauron, by the time we encounter him in the Lord of the Rings, doesn't have a body anymore. At the beginning, the Valar and the Maiar do, right? And consider what happens with Gandalf, right? When he falls and he's basically disembodied because he does die, and then he's sent back. He's basically given a new body, which now looks more like Saruman's. If we go back to, we were talking about the voice of Saruman, right? And the problem of who is Gandalf once he becomes Saruman, once he becomes Saruman as he should have been. That the Valar become incarnate too, right? And this is the way Tolkien describes it. Now the Valar took to themselves shape and hue, and because they were drawn into the world by love of the children of Iluvatar, for whom they hoped, they took shape after that manner which they had beheld in the vision of Iluvatar, save only in majesty and splendor. Moreover, their shape comes of their knowledge of the visible world rather than of the world itself, and they need it not, save only as we use raiment, and yet as we may be naked and suffer no loss of our being. Therefore the Valar may walk, if they will, unclad, and then even the Eldar cannot clearly perceive them, though they be present. But when they desire to clothe themselves, the Valar take upon them forms, some as of male and some as of female. For that difference of temper they had even from their beginning, and it is but bodied forth in the choice of each, not made by the choice, even as with us male and female may be shown in the raiment, but is not made thereby. You want to know why Tolkien's really super dangerous right now? It's that, right? He's not sexist. He's just believes in the relationship between our interior sense of gender and our actual embodiment. But the shapes wherein the great ones array themselves are not at all times like to the shape of the kings and queens of the children of Iluvatar, for at times they may clothe themselves in their own thought, made visible in forms of majesty and dread. Think about that. It's like in the Valaquinta it says, oh, they're lords and queens. Well, yeah, how do you know? And that they, in the commentary to Major Bowen, Tolkien emphasizes this again. They were thus in the world. Okay, so they were allowed to do so. They were allowed to enter into it. And the great among them became the equivalent of the gods of traditional mythologies. But a condition was that they would remain in it until the story was finished. So it's like once they've entered into the story, they're kind of stuck in it, right? They're stuck in history. They're stuck in time. So they've come into time, but in coming into time, they also can put on flesh, right? They can incarnate. They were thus in the world, but not of a kind whose essential nature is to be physically incarnate. They were self-incarnated if they wished. And then it goes on to reiterate that with the sense that their clothes were the expressions of their desires, mood, wills, and functions. They've entered, and again, he still wants this to be understandable to or believable by mind that believes in the Trinity, but the mystery that he's playing with is the incarnation over and over and over again, right? That they are there somehow at the beginning, singing the patterns of creation, and then and you realize that there's a passage like, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was God. Through him all things were made. Why I don't have my Bible sitting here? Why can't I rehearse that passage completely off the top of my head? I'm not sure. That the Word is that by whom all things were made. That they are, well, okay, now they're skirting close to being the second person of the Trinity, not just the creator, which is kind of tricky. But that is the mystery of the creation. Is for Tolkien is very much the mystery both of the pattern being made visible and be given being, and what it could mean for these angelic invisible creatures to enter into it and themselves take on form so as to participate further in the making. I had one more passage, and I'm thinking, yes, okay, so this is another letter. This one is one of the long explanation letters that he writes. Sorry, that previous one I was just telling you is the letter to Major Bowen, which was from 1957. This is a letter from 1958, which was to Miss Rona Bear, who asked some questions. Again, he emphasizes over and over and over again, because of their love of Ea, because of the part they'd played in its making, they wished to and could incarnate themselves in visible physical forms, though these were comparable to our clothes, insofar as our clothes are personal expression, not to our bodies. Their forms were thus expressions of their persons' powers and loves. They need not be anthropomorphic. Yavanna, the wife of Aule, would, for instance, appear in the form of a great tree. Okay, I hadn't noticed that before, and I'd forgotten that. If Yavanna appears as a tree, that's a very Marian image. Don't go there. I'll never get out of this. But the habitual shapes of the Valar, when visible or clothed, were anthropomorphic because of their intense concern with elves and men. Okay, so they've fallen in love with their vision, and they've entered into Arda. They're artists, and they want to participate in its making, and in this making they can take on physical visible forms and self-incarnate. All right, so and this entry into incarnation brings also with it an entry into time. What on earth is Tolkien doing here? Well, I have two sort of theorizings. He complains in the letter to Major Bowen when he's setting up all of this, sort of the more you try to explain all of this stuff, right? We've got this great story about singing the pattern of creation and entering into it, and then but we start wondering about, well, what does it mean to be self-incarnate, and are they really gendered in their bodies, and exactly what does that mean? Well, is the gender actually, according to Tolkien, the gendering of the Valar are in themselves before they take on the bodies, and the bodies are just kind of clothes. So that's tricky. That they have this preoccupation with the elves and the men, which we'll talk more about in the future. Can we explain all of this? And Tolkien sort of defaults, as usual, at this point when he's writing to Major Bowen again, I'm sorry if all this seems dreary and pompous. Pompous? Pompose. But so do all attempts to explain the images and events of a mythology. Naturally, the stories come first. But it is, I suppose, some test of the consistency of a mythology as such, if it is capable of some sort of rational or rationalized explanation. Now, consider that, right? It's like, I get it, right? I really do get that when Tolkien, he gets people, you know, it's like all theology is this, right? We have this great story in the Bible. We have Jesus, who is the Word of God, who was with God at the beginning and is God, and it's through the Word that all things are made, entering into the creation, taking on flesh, and here he is, part of the story, and now he's subject to time and subject to history, and oh wait, what did I just do? Right? Theology is this exercise of, theologos is talking about God, right? So you're just theologizing, you're talking about God, but it's this impulse to take the thing that you've learned through story, which and I would agree with Tolkien. It's like Tolkien, I mean, I have to use his letters to do a lot of this sort of theorizing, because he doesn't over theorize his stories, right? He doesn't have his characters give little speeches every so often, as you get in some fiction, explaining the mythology that they're all living by. They just don't do it. I mean, they maybe Faramir says a little bit about saying grace, who knows, right? But most of the time, or Gandalf gives you some little terse quip. Most of the time, Tolkien does not have any of his characters explain anything, right? They are in the story insofar as they give sort of other information from that which they experience themselves. It's more backstory, right? It's more story, right? The story just carries on further and further into the mists of time, as it were. But Tolkien himself, in his stories proper, doesn't do a lot of that theorizing. And then all of his readers in the 50s start writing to him, and you can say a lot of what happens in these later volumes of the History of Middle-earth, particularly Morgoth's Ring, you get much more effort on Tolkien's part to give the theoretical structure, and this one in Morgoth's Ring, it's particularly about the elves, right? But in the Athrabeth Finrod Andreth, which we should talk about in detail, he tries at one point to let two characters sort of talk through all of this theology, and they get sort of close and kind of skittish about it. Probably because Tolkien understands that, the more you sort of theorize the story, the drier and drearier and oddly less real it becomes. It's like if you are living the story, you know the truth of it. But if you are trying to explain the story from outside, as it were, even from outside, it's like it doesn't work anymore. And that is to my mind, I think, what happens for me, particularly with most theology as such. It's like I find it amazingly hard to read, right? And I think it's like they're taking a truth, a character, a reality, and trying to take it apart, right? It's God ends up dissected on a table, and you're supposed to believe somehow that is the creator of everything. So Tolkien's trying to do theology without killing God. How's that? And what he sees it doing, but he understands that you have to put the characters into the story and give your reader some way of well, how does he do it? How does he do it? I have two suggestions of more theorizing. Theoria is actually not a bad thing, right? Theoria just means contemplation, right? So if you are engaging in contemplation as opposed to living according to Jesus' example, which is, I highly recommend that. The imitation of Christ, the living by Christ's example, absolutely critical. But if you get caught up in this kind of contemplation meditation and wanting to see the face of God, understand, you may, as the scholastics did, get kind of tangled up in wanting to know all of the bits and pieces and how exactly this works. Tolkien had a couple friends who also theorized to a certain extent in this way, but they did it, I think, more effectively than any theologian I've read, although I can't say that I read a lot of theology, right? But as I say, there are ways in which we can theorize this problem of understanding God's relationship with his creation without breaking the story, I hope. One, and I don't have the book to hand on this because it's stuck in my office on campus, was his friend Owen Barfield, right? And if you're familiar with the Inklings, there's Lewis and Tolkien and Charles Williams, and maybe you've heard of Charles Williams because he also wrote some novels which are impossible to read and I never get through them. Williams was very, very interested in the Holy Spirit. I could say Tolkien is most interested in showing the workings of the Trinity within his stories. Lewis is doing something completely different and not as Trinitarian as Tolkien is. Williams is very interested in the Holy Spirit. There was a fourth Inkling, though, who was back behind all three of these, named Owen Barfield, who actually fed the entire group better with his sort of theorizing of literature, I think, than anybody else. And in particular, he did so in a book called Poetic Diction, which should tell you everything you need to know about it. He's trying to understand what kind of speaking poetry is and how it creates reality for our consciousness. I think that's an accurate statement. And one of the things that he was very, very interested in was this relationship that we've talked about before between language and mythology, right? If you remember back in thinking about the fairy stories, right? On fairy stories. Where's that book? Right, we were in the Tolkien reader and we were talking about on fairy stories, and Tolkien was worrying about what Max Mueller said about mythology being a disease of language, right? Well, Barfield comes up with this way of understanding the opposite, which is language as a disease of mythology by way of the breakdown of the breakdown of speech from metaphor. So, let me make sure I got this correct in this. Just right. So Tolkien thought of languages as a disease of mythology, and the development of consciousness, this development of language, involving a fracturing, a splintering, right? One of the things that Tolkien just said to Lewis in Mythopoeia was that there's this splintered light that we see by, right? The splintering of consciousness into a sort of differentiation between the spiritual, the cognitive, and the physical. And you realize that I've been talking to you about the way in which the Ainur, as spirits, as angelic beings, as music, enter into the physical world and then start making it, right? Tolkien is trying to show you that process as the way in which our consciousness comes to understand these sorts of things. And he gets this very specifically from things that he read, or that he learned from Barfield. Now, okay, I even when I teach this in class, I always have trouble sort of launching this at people, because Barfield is so dense. All right, so for example, take the word that we have, that's spirit, right? Spirit, if you talk about the Holy Spirit or these Valar or angelic spirits, you're talking about, what are you talking about? What is spirit? Well, in Latin, it's a Latin word, spiritus is a Latin word, it originally meant blowing or wind, right? It's like the Holy Spirit is the holy blowing. The holy wind, right? And consider, every time we talk about spirits, we're talking about the invisible world. We're talking about these kinds of creatures that we are beyond our understanding. No. Spirits are blowing, right? Spiritus is the holy blowing. But Barfield argued, he says, when the principle of life within man or animal had to be named, its outward sign, namely the breath of the mouth, was naturally chosen to express it. So you say you have life, right? You have this something that's different from just your physical stuffiness, right? And think about that Tolkien is trying with the Ainur becoming Valar to reverse this for you, right? To show you that the Ainur, who were spirits, take on flesh, become bodies. Well, you who are incarnate, physical, like, okay, clothes is one thing, flesh is another. You who are incarnate, how do you know what you are, that you are alive? Right? And that's what Barfield says, right? That when you want to talk about life, you say it's spirit. The breath, that, our breathness, it would be like if in English we had this one word, breath, and breath means the principle of life that we have within us. Again, still Barfield, when it was perceived that there was something else to be named, not the mere animal life, but that which was supported by this animal life, with that same word was chosen to express the spiritual as opposed to the mere material or animal element in man. All this is a metaphor, right? This is the huge key that both Barfield and I'm going to show you, Sayers, and what I think is happening with Tolkien latched onto, right? That if we're trying to understand how we understand God, among everything else, right? We are thinking somehow in metaphors, right? And this is the process that Tolkien is trying to illustrate for you with these Valar, these spirits, these Ainur who become Valar powers. So what Barfield argues is that spiritus, which we now use to mean a variety of things, breath, wind, and spirit, right? So it's a holy blowing. It could be just the wind, the spiritus, a blowing or wind. It could be the blowing of your body, which is your breath, or it could be that something. We don't have a word for it other than spirit, right? It could be that something which is your life, right? Is it a blowing? Is it your blowing? Or is it your life, your spirit of life, right? What Barfield thought and Tolkien read in Poetic Diction was that spiritus originally meant, quote, neither breath, nor wind, nor spirit, nor yet all three of these things, but rather, according to Barfield, had its own peculiar meaning, which has since, in the course of the evolution of consciousness, crystallized into the three meanings specified. Talk about the Trinity, right? It's like the 3 in 1, as far as Barfield was concerned, was just there at the beginning of the language, right? And this is, I mean, I'm obvious. Okay, one, I hope you guys are all watching, everybody, because all of us are doing the same thing, right? Owen and Fox and even Milo when he's talking about certain things right now. The mystery is going to be the same mystery over and over and over again. And the mystery of the way the words work to fold in on themselves multiple meanings, so that, if you have, oh golly, what was the word that I heard Owen talking about? That's the same word. oh, sorry, I don't remember, but the homonyms, right? If it's this one word that sounds like this other word, and it points you to this sort of relationship that you then understand is outside of, simple identity, but has this kind of, I don't want to say spiritual right now, but metaphor is the strong word for it. But metaphor is tricky because people don't you think of metaphor as this just basic literary device, when what Barfield and Tolkien, and I'm going to show you, Sayers all realized is that the metaphor is the primary cognitive power, right? It's the primary cognitive, I'm going to say exercise. Metaphor makes thought possible. How's that? We cannot think without metaphor at all, which is why when we start talking about things like God, we're kind of stuck, right? Except for, as Tolkien understood, as Barfield understood, as Sayers understood, except for insofar as we understand that we're always speaking through metaphor. So that Barfield thinks of the sort of, there's this word spiritus that somehow means breath, wind, and spirit all at the same time. So this movement outside of, just within the world, the breath of the wind, the breath of the physical incarnate person, our life, and then spirit, that life within us, so that this is how language becomes this disease of mythology, that we start being able to talk about different kinds of categories of reality, because the myth that was originally all of these things folded in at the same time together has fractured into the physical, the cognitive, and the spiritual. Let me give you an example, because I'm sure that's a little tricky, right? So we know that Tolkien and Barfield were friends, and the Zalewski's book on the Inklings is actually really excellent. If you want to, Philip and Carol Zalewski's book on the Inklings, the Fellowship. Sorry, I forgot what their title is. Fellowship. Their book about the Inklings has a wonderful account of Barfield and his importance. He actually, his career postdates both Lewis and Tolkien's death, right? He lives longer than everybody and has a lecture career in the United States and such after they die, but is less well known now, partly because he is more theoretical and not the stories, I think, but maybe also because we're just not very good right now at thinking poetically. Consider that. Okay, so we know Tolkien is friends with Barfield, and we know that his influence is throughout, and I catch it specifically in Tolkien's closer descriptions of the actual powers, right? The actual Valar. And we had, I gave you the way Barfield talks about spiritus, because I'm going to now read you Tolkien's description of Manwë. Manwë and Melkor were brethren in the thought of Ilúvatar. So that's interesting. Just like Melkor, we talked about last time, is the he who rises in might. But in Tolkien's understanding, we're like, somehow these two are actually brothers, right? The great battle is going to be effectively between brothers. The mightiest of those Ainur who came into the world was in his beginning Melkor, but Manwë is dearest to Ilúvatar and understands most clearly his purposes, right? So they're very close to being in the mind of Ilúvatar. Manwë was appointed to be, in the fullness of all time, the first of all kings, lord of the realm of Arda, and ruler of all that dwell therein. Okay, fine. So Manwë is the big guy. In Arda, his delight is in the winds and the clouds, right? And in all the regions of the air, from the heights to the depths, from the utmost borders of the vale of Arda to the breezes that blow in the grass. Sulimo he is surnamed, Lord of the breath of Arda. All swift birds, strong of wing, he loves. They come and go at his bidding. Look what Tolkien did there, just in that description, right? That he's taken, Manwë is the closest in thought to Ilúvatar. He's the breath of Arda. Can you get any closer? In the beginning was the word, right? He's the spirit, the breath, the wind, the Lord of the powers. Somehow he is metaphor incarnate, right? Manwë has taken on body. He will in the stories, right? He'll be there in the stories, but he is Lord of the breath of Arda. He is the wind and the breathing and the spirit of the creature. Okay, I have a high fancy theorizing of what's going on here, and this is in fact from another. I'm introducing you to some pretty high level stuff. I appreciate that this time, and I'm trying to go slow so I don't skit away into, oh look, it's all metaphor, right? It is, and you need to understand how structured and powerful that claim is, right? One of our greatest scholars of Tolkien's thinking is Verlyn Flieger, and she's written very, very powerfully, particularly in her book Splintered Light, on the way in which Tolkien activates metaphor through his stories in order to show you the way metaphors actually happen, right? And she said this is her claim, and in Splintered Light she's doing it with light, but I think we can also see how Tolkien's doing it here with the concept of spirit, right? The spirit of the Lord is among you. Right? What does that mean to say that spirit is there with you? The breath, the wind, the word, the life, right? That Flieger's argument is Tolkien's approach is first to restore words their primal unity of concept, as we saw with Barfield, right? That spiritus means breath, wind, spirit all together. Tolkien is going to restore to all of the words that he's using their primal unity of concept, and then to set up a progressive fragmentation of both word and percept as these express a changing relationship to the fictive world and a diminishing reflecting of its light. His technique is to confer literality on what would in the primary world be called metaphor, and then to illustrate the process by which the literal becomes metaphoric. You got all that? Okay. So mythology and language. Mythology, the story gives rise to language, is his primary sort of philological claim, right? That the story itself, and you remember he made all of these stories, he said, to give a place for the languages to live, his Elvish languages, but he is also interested in the way in which there are things that can be said in story through the metaphors that drive story, as it were, that make thinkable concepts that we wouldn't have access to otherwise. For example, the Trinity, right, which is my main claim in this particular exercise, right? That and I played a joke on you in the title, right? There's no breath of gods in this episode. There's the breath of God. What does that mean, right? What does it mean to have a spirit that blows through the world and is itself also somehow divine, which is the mind, the mind's wrestling with this as the problem of the Trinity. And that's what Tolkien said he wanted to do, right? He said he wanted to make his mythology be believable to how did he say it? I'm going to be precise. Acceptable, right? He said he wanted these powers, these beings, to have the power that could be acceptable to a mind that believes in the Blessed Trinity. So he's trying to give you, through these Valar, an understanding of the properties of the divine that you as, or he, but as reader, you as a believing Christian in the Trinity can accept, and interestingly do better theology, I think, than most theologians, in fact all theologians, right? Because if you don't get it in the story, if you don't get it in the way in which you can enter into it with the creatures, you're not going to understand who God is. Should we be worried? Okay, this is yet another favorite book. You need to know this book. Dorothy Sayers' The Mind of the Maker is, I think, the single greatest work of theology that I know, right? Certainly. So I'll just say I think it's the single greatest one. As far as I know, this is the great work of theology that we need, because she's trying to understand the primary metaphor of Christianity, which is, and she says this, and let's like just start with this. In the beginning, God created. He made this and he made that, and he saw that it was good. And he created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created he them. Which is, of course, what Tolkien is pointing to with the Valar, right? That you need to know male and female as part of the primary creation. That matters within the creation. And we'll get to that, not this episode. Thus far, the author of Genesis. And what Sayers points out is, well, isn't it interesting that the only thing we in fact know about God, and if you take the way in which we say the creed, right? I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and all things visible and invisible. I think that's the Apostles' Creed. I'm not really good at the Nicene Creed because that's not the one I memorized. That the thing that we know as Christians about God is he's creator, right? And she talks about how the Jews, she says, keenly alive to the perils of pictorial metaphor, forbade the representation of the person of God in graven images. If you're worrying about whether or not you can make a statue, well, you're kind of too late because you're speaking, right? And that is, it's again, it's a Christians get it, right? We do get it. You get the word, right? You get that you are speaking about God. And Sayers points this out. Nevertheless, human nature and the nature of human language defeated them, the Jews, in their desire not to make any pictures of God. No legislation could prevent the making of verbal pictures. If you are talking about God at all, right, and go back to what, Tolkien, saying, how can he, as a mind that believes in the Blessed Trinity, dare to write stories about the Valar and stories about the gods? Well, for goodness sake, you've got the Bible. You're already doing it, right? You are already within that depicting of God, even if you're only using words, right? We're using words. Well, how accurate do you think those words are for talking about the creator of heaven and earth? She says, no legislation could prevent the making of verbal pictures. God walks in the garden. He stretches out his arm. His voice shakes the cedars. His eyelids try the children of men. To forbid the making of pictures about God would be to forbid thinking about God at all. For man is so made that he has no way to think except in pictures. Now, just isn't that delightful, right? It's like she's saying you can worry about making idols and making graven images and pictures and things like that, but every time you speak, and you could say this in Judaism, means you never say the name of God, the holy name, the Yahweh, that we do not say. You're reading in the temple, you say Adonai, which is translated in Greek, Kyrios, which is translated into Latin Dominus. So every time you say the Psalms and you say Dominus in Latin, you're saying Lord, right? It's a name, which, but the thing is, it doesn't matter. Absolutely every one of those is going to be a picture of some sort. And it's interesting that in the ancient temple practice, reading the scriptures, you don't say the holy name, making it to a certain extent a kind of idol, right? A magic word that only certain special people could say, whereas Jesus says, everybody says Abba, our Father, right? We name God constantly as Christians. We certainly name him as our Lord Jesus Christ. Lord is one of these God names in that appellation, right? So she's saying, over and over and over again throughout the history of Christianity, the voice of warning has been raised against the power of the picture makers. God is a spirit without body, parts, or passion. He's pure being. I am that I am. And as far as Sayers is concerned, and she's delightful, she's saying, to worry about this, to worry that we're speaking about God in metaphors, well, we can't talk about, that we're speaking about him in anthropomorphic metaphors, which often people worry about. She's saying, well, everything we say is in relation to our own existence as human beings, right? And thinking about the way Tolkien makes the Valar take on human appearance, right? Human bodies, as it were, because they want to interact with the elves and the men. They want to interact with those of us who have this kind of body, so that's the sort they take on. That our language, as Sayers is saying, does the same thing, right? Absolutely everything that we talk about. You still with me here? Anyways, Barwin and Barfield has us understanding that our original conceptualization at all was always metaphorical. Tolkien is trying to show you the way the metaphors break into concepts by way of his storytelling. Sayers is now showing us the way in which, well, all of our language in talking about God is necessarily metaphorical. And the primary metaphor, she says, is God created. Right? It's like, that's why she's talking about the mind of the maker. This is, in fact, a book about artists, right? It's a book about the way in which artists participate in that divine activity, right? That subcreation, as Tolkien would say. But what she has to do first is show you that, you know, as Christians, we are made in the image and likeness of a maker. And that it's that understanding of ourselves as artists that is the most perfect reflection of our creator, right? It's like we're made in the image and likeness of God. Well, what is God? What do we know about God from the scriptures, the Bible? Well, we know we created, right? That's it, right? So we as creatures make things. How does making work? And this is my last big thing. If you're still with me now, I'm going to go get a cup of coffee. Pause the video, go get a cup of coffee, come back. This is the secret of the Trinity, right? It's the problem of creativity, the problem of making, and the mystery of the Trinity is the mystery of the activity that we see God involved in as creator. I'll say that again. If I could do this like with true live streaming videos and stuff, I'd say make you watch this again. Watch it again. When we talk about the mystery of the Trinity, we're talking about the mystery of creation. We are trying to understand the activity of creation, which is, if you think about it, again, exactly what Tolkien is trying to show you in his sort of transition from Ainur to Valar, right? This is transition from the singing angelic spirits, which now you're never going to hear that word again without like ratcheting off into breath and wind. The spirits enter into the creation and take on bodies, male and female, and they participate in time and so forth. We're trying to understand the activity of creation, and that's where the Trinity comes in. It's not a sort of three gods in one three-headed thing, you know, here we have three beings that are all somehow one being. No, it's an activity of making that we, made in the image and likeness of that maker, also participate in. How do you make something? Right? How do you make something? Well, so for her purposes, she uses the mind of the creative writer, and writers are one kind of artist, right? I'm that kind of artist, although here I am talking to you, so I suppose that makes me a sort of verbal artist in some other ways. I'm making this video, right? But also, I make books. I understand the metaphor, the process that she's describing, because I've gone through it myself. If you engaged in our, great unauthorized Bertaria world are making things, I hope this makes sense to you. Make sense. Making, we are making sense right now. Let's make some sense, okay? So the mind of the creative writer, she thinks it's also true of all other kinds of artists, painters, musicians, workers of the creative imagination in any form. And this is the trinity of activity that goes into making art, right? And here she actually quotes, and this is the best sort of description of the activity of the Trinity I know. She's quoting from a play that she wrote, which is nice. It's a play called "The Zeal of Thy House," which was about the building of Canterbury Cathedral. Therefore, very interesting because it's a play about a maker who, in fact, as architect, fell and hurt himself, and so the problem in the play is his activity as architect when he's wounded. But the conclusion she has is spoken by Saint Michael, the archangel. So it's spoken by the angelic spirit, and in other places she has. I think I remember that from somewhere else. She had a young man. She says come up to her and said, "How did you How did you come up with this theology stuff? It's great. Where you surely made that all up yourself." And she's like, no. So in the play, we get this sort of concluding description of what creative work is like. And here it is, right? Here's the Trinity. Here is the Trinity of creation. And it's the Trinity of the activity of God. For every work or act of creation is threefold, an earthly trinity to match the heavenly. First, not in time, but in order of enumeration. So outside of time, right? Just like the Valar, there's, as Ainur singing with Iluvatar, but outside of time, first, there is the creative idea, passionless, timeless, beholding the whole work complete at once, the end in the beginning. And this is the image of the Father. All right, so there's Iluvatar, the All-Father, outside of time, no time, timeless. It's like you can't be outside of something that doesn't, it's like passionless, beholding the whole work, just as the Ainur did when they sing the song, that they make the music, they sing the music, and they're outside. It's at the time simply of idea, right? But Arda doesn't exist yet, right? It doesn't have full being. It doesn't have material incarnate being until, second, there is the creative energy or activity begotten of that idea, right? She is doing this, the energy or activity, the word spoken, working in time from the beginning to the end with sweat and passion, being incarnate in the bonds of matter. And this is the image of the Word, right? So there's the Father, the pattern, the idea, the whole work complete at once. It's meaningless to ask whether or not God knows everything, because God's outside of the time story, right? But, and this is where Tolkien his creation story matches this beautifully. Because he has those thoughts, the offspring of Iluvatar's thoughts, enter into time, become part of the history, stuck in the history until it's all finished, incarnate, and capable of suffering, right? Which is in the claim of the incarnation is God enters in as Christ, the Word, into the creature and suffers and dies for real, right? In time. And so if you're wondering about how Jesus is praying in the garden to God the Father, in time to out of time, I mean, he is praying to the Father, but the activity is he's caught in time now. He's caught in our history. He's caught in our reality. We know this. We're in this story now, even if we can see the whole thing as it's been revealed to us in the scriptures, and so we know what the whole story is. We still have to live it ourselves, right? So our making, our energy goes into being in this story. And third, and this I think is, people neglect the effect of the Spirit too much, right? It's like, how does the Spirit work? What's the Holy Spirit? What is the wind that blows through all? Well, third, there is the creative power, the meaning of the work, and its response in the lively soul. And this is the image of the indwelling Spirit. And these three are one, each equally in itself, the whole work, whereof none can exist without the other. And this is the image of the Trinity. Now, we can test this, and that's to a large extent what Sayers does with the rest of the book, right? That she's going to show you how this metaphor of idea, energy, power actually plays out. What concerns her is, in the metaphors used by the Christian creeds about the mind of the maker, the creative artist can recognize a true relation to his own experience, and it is his business to record the fact of that recognition in any further metaphor that the reader may understand and apply. But we are, as writers, participating in this activity. If you don't buy it, though, right, it's like she has these wonderful little discussions saying, okay, so does the book exist when you have an idea about it, right? How many of you have ideas of books, right? You got, it all came to you, or you're in the shower, the whole story came to you, right? I know it now. Bango, I have it. I have the idea. Does the book exist? Can anybody else be affected by it? No, it's all completely in your mind, right? Which is where she's saying the Father, outside of time and passion and effect on the world, it exists simply as an idea. He says the idea of the book is a thing in itself, quite apart from its awareness or its manifestation in energy, though it still remains true that it cannot be known as a thing in itself except as the energy reveals it. The energy, she says, is an easier idea to grasp, or maybe it isn't, right? You've got the idea, right? You got your idea for the book. How are you going to do it? How long does it take to write a book? Any of you done it? If you have, you know that it takes toil, trouble, difficulty, choice, feeling, thought, triumph. It's suffering. It's triumph. It's joy. And the thing is, okay, even making these videos, this is hard work for me. I don't know whether you can tell, right? I am exhausted after I do one of these, right? It's a speaking out, it's speaking forth, it's performing, right? I get that, you can get energy back if you have an audience, and I get energy from the thought of you watching this video, but I have to express that, the thought that I had, even these are, the notes that I make before I come on camera. It's still mainly in my head, and then I have to express it, right? So this is idea energy. Once it's out there, and this is the word, once you've heard it, right? Certainly in our publication forms, once it's been like made concrete some way, either in a video or in a book or something like that, the creative power is this third person, this third element of the creative activity. Once it's out there in the world, it flows back to the writer from his own activity and makes him, as it were, the reader of his own book. I can sit down and read my own book. Fancy that, right? It's all in my head. I suffered to write it, and now it exists as this thing outside of me. Well, so can everybody else read it. You all can watch this video, and that power, she's describing metaphorically, the means by which the activity is communicated to other readers and which produces a corresponding response in them. In fact, from the reader's point of view, it is the book, right? Do you think of it as the book when it's just in my head? No. Do you think of the book when I'm writing it? Well, no, because you don't have it. It's like some of you, I've even seen a complaint once or twice, maybe somewhere, saying, why doesn't she make these videos into a book? I don't like books. The video is painful. That was very interesting. It's like painful. I'm sorry, is my voice painful, or is the time that it takes to listen to me talk this all out the painful part, right? It's the incarnation. The incarnation of being in the video is the second person, right? So we pray, when we pray to God our Father, we pray through Jesus Christ, because we pray through his suffering, through his incarnation, through his being in the world. Are you starting to get it, right? And then the book exists, and the reader thinks, like, I think of Dorothy Sayers' Mind of the Maker as this thing that I can read. By it, they perceive the book both as a process in time and as an eternal whole, and react to it dynamically. It is at this point that we begin to understand what St. Hilary means in saying of the Trinity, eternity is in the Father, form in the image, and use in the gift. And then she says, lastly, these three are one, each equally in itself the whole work, whereof none can exist without the other. If you were to ask a writer, which is the real book, his idea of it, his activity in writing it, or its return to himself in power, he would be at a loss to tell you, because these three things are essentially inseparable. Each of them is the complete book separately, yet in the complete book, all of them exist together. Right? So that's the mystery of the Trinity. It's not it's three persons, but forget the person part. It's these elements of, it's the elements. It's like, okay, one, every time you start trying to talk about this, you realize you're living in the metaphor of the word that you're trying to articulate and break apart into spirit, breath, wind, right? And if you say, what's the book? Anybody who comes to me and says, I have an idea for a book, does he have a book? No, of course not, because the book is not incarnate yet. Once it's incarnate in any form, you can write one copy, then it has power, right? Then you can sit back and read it yourself, right? Even as the one who wrote it out, right? This is as incarnate as this now, right? So I can read back my own notes, and that acts back on me, even though I was the one who wrote that piece of paper down, right? I'm not letting you guys out without understanding that the Trinity is real. But it's this reality of the metaphor that we understand. We're made in the language that we use to talk about the Creator in whose image and likeness we are made. Okay, so I think Tolkien actually succeeds beautifully in his mythological it's like re-metaphorization. I don't even have a word for it. It's like what Flieger says, that restore words their primal unity of concept, and then set up a progressive fragmentation of both word and percept, as these express a changing relationship to the fictive world and a diminishing reflecting of its light. His technique is to confer literality on what in the primary world would be called metaphor, like Ainur, Valar, and then to illustrate the process by which the literal becomes metaphoric. He's showing you by way of, and you have to, it's like, think about the way the hobbits have to suffer through the story to get to the understanding. You, as reader, need to read through it for it to work on you. And you, by participating in the story, come to the realization, the understanding of the concepts. So we are made in the image and likeness of the Maker, and the story is meant to show us what that means. That's all very, beautiful, but exactly where does evil come from? To be continued.